something now. Prince Ebel, Du Bois went over to Africa, and he brought a gift back for Ann Spencer. And it's, my grandmother's home is a national landmark, and the garden is a historical garden. And there's a pond back there, and there's a Prince Ebel, a skull of a Prince Ebel that was brought back in a gift from Du Bois, and it has a water fountain and a little pipe that he squirts water out of his mouth, and it's a statue of Prince Ebel. When you said that, from Nigeria.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, so your grandmother knew a lot of people.
Very, very powerful. My grandmother and grandfather. I have to emphasize the Edward Spencer allowed Ann Spencer to live the life that she lived. Okay. I mean, she never had to have a job. She never even had to cook. She didn't have to clean.
Well, let's pick up with your father's story. Then after, now,
okay,
we make this great breakthrough, and of course, black pilots are trained at Tuskegee.
Yes.
And the story, is that they reached a couple snags, but Mrs. Roosevelt came over. You want to tell
yeah,
us that story?
I can. Are we on?
Yeah, we're on.
Okay. Okay. After the flight and their successful flight and meeting with then Senator Truman, and then Truman's position in being the president of the United States, and well, first of all, let me back up a little bit. When Roosevelt formed what he called his Black Air Force, the 99 Pursuit Squadron, which was the first squadron of the Tuskegee Airmen. The Tuskegee Airmen consist of the 99 Squadron, the 100, the 301, and the 302. And compiling them together, we call them the 332nd Fighter Group. That group was led by B.O. Davis, Jr. and Spanky Roberts. Spanky Roberts was his second in command, and Spanky Roberts was left over in Liberia while they brought B.O. Davis to Selfridge to form the 332nd here in Michigan. And then later on they got together. The 99th Squadron was the only squadron that flew with the white pilots before they separated them. And then they separated them and created the segregation within the armed forces. And obviously we know how the Tuskegee Airmen became the heroes that they are by being escort pilots and the record that they hold that nobody can match, whether it be perfect or not. And the connection that my father had with the Tuskegee Airmen directly is that my father took the position as race relations officer at Patterson Field. Well, before he took that position...
This is in Dayton.
This is in Dayton. Okay. Well, actually Fairfield, Ohio.
Fairborn.
Fairborn, thank you, in Fairborn, Ohio. And so when he took that position, he applied as an instrument mechanic. And he was hired. He was the first African-American hired at Patterson Field as an instrument mechanic. And that was in 1941. Now let me back up a little bit to tell you about his military, because my father was in the military and a civilian at the same time. He was part of the 8th Regiment out of Chicago, and he was sent to Battle Creek, Michigan to do his training. And well, before he did that,
this is in World War I.
This is in World War II. Yeah, 1940.
Okay.
Yeah, and so he was sent down to Battle Creek. Well, before he was sent down to Battle Creek, his colonel was Colonel Pitts. Colonel Pitts was one of the first African-American colonels, and he comes from World War I. And Colonel Pitts was a friend of my father's, and all the guys that were in the 8th Regiment, they all worked at the post office, so they all knew each other. So they said, well, Chauncey, you just got married, so why don't you just stay out and come in March? So they got married in August of 1940, and in March of 1941, he reports to Battle Creek, Michigan, Fort Custer. And he stayed there until October of 1941, when they came out with the age limit that if you were over 27 years old, you were put on a reserve status. My father was in his 30s at that time, so he passed the age limit, so he couldn't be an active duty person. So meanwhile, he had applied for a job at Patterson Field as an instrument mechanic, and he was hired. And he was put in there, and the so-called whites in there, they boycotted the office and the garage and said that they wouldn't come in. If this colored guy was going to be there, they weren't going to be there. So they said, what the heck are we going to do? Well, meanwhile, Roosevelt's Executive Order 8802, fair employment, non-discrimination in the federal government, and anybody that has federal...
Oh. Sorry, I didn't want to stop.
That has federal contracts.
Go back and
start
at the beginning of the sentence.
Okay. Oh, wow. Roosevelt's Executive Order 8802 was brought out in 1941. Well, they because of the dislikes for this so-called Negro as an instrument mechanic, being Chauncey Spencer, the whites in the office decided they were going to boycott the office. Well, they said, what are we going to do? I mean, this is during wartime. We need these instrument mechanics working. So they said, well, what can we do? Well, we had to have somebody to expedite this Executive Order 8802. So they went back and checked Chauncey Spencer's background and found out he had a degree in sociology and had been a social worker. They said, that sounds like a fix. Well, Judge Hastings was appointed as a civilian aide to the Secretary of War, Stinson, at the time. So my father was to report to Colonel Estabrook. And Colonel Estabrook was in charge of Patterson Field Air Material Command. And Judge Hastings was his civilian aide. Judge Hastings was the contact that Chauncey Spencer would have at Tuskegee. So on May the 6th, they transferred Chauncey Spencer from Patterson Field to Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama. Well, my mother had just married my father, and she didn't want to stay as a stranger there in Dayton, Ohio. So they allowed her, because she worked for the Air Force, she was a procurement officer, they allowed her to take a leave and go down with her new husband. So she helped set up the records there in Tuskegee, because when the Tuskegee Airmen first went down there were a bunch of civilians that went down to Tuskegee to build the base, and they called it Tent City. They were living in tents. And my mother and my father, they lived with some of the professors at Tuskegee University there off of campus. And a lot of the men there, they lived in the dorms at Tuskegee University. Well, long story short here, what the connection is between that, my father was sent down there posing as an instrument mechanic because of the trouble that they got of the reports that were not allowing black newspapers to report the activities down in Tuskegee. So they sent my father down there as an undercover, reporting back to to Judge Hastings and Colonel Estabrook. And during that time, they found out the bad treatment that Colonel Kimball and William G. Williams, who was a captain, were given the Jim Crow way of life. And if you didn't like it, you knew where the door was at for you who lived in the North, and you need to go straight back north because it's not going to change here. So my father reported back, and there was a lot of things that went on while he was there. And he reported back the deplorable treatment that was being given to the men down in Tuskegee. And they replaced Colonel Kimball and William G. Williams with then Noah Parrish, and they promoted B.O. Davis as captain over the Tuskegee Airmen, which, by the way, the Tuskegee Airmen is just a name that a group of individuals came here in Detroit in 1972 to form a club to see how interested they would be in having annual reunions, and it became an organization later on. Back then, they called them Colored Birdmen, and they probably called us a couple other names too. But it wasn't the Tuskegee Airmen, because the treatment that the blacks got down in Tuskegee, the last thing they wanted to do was wear that on their shoulders and say, I'm from Tuskegee, I'm a Tuskegee Airman, because they were not treated real good. And I don't believe they wanted to carry that around with them. Okay, thank you.
Colored Birdmen.
Colored Birdmen.
Wow.
Yep.
Okay. So they weren't referred in the paper as Tuskegee Airmen at all?
No,
Okay.
no, not at that time. Not at that time. It's an organization. The Tuskegee Airmen is an organization, and it's been put together now to supposedly, and we're working hard on trying to get that to happen, to inspire our young people into science and math and using aviation as a magnet to do so. That's what it's all about. And we use the legacy of these men who had to work side by side in one small room and not kill each other and be successful, to show you how people can do things without having everything laid out for them.
Okay. Now,
Yes,
the story of Tuskegee Airmen is, as we've heard it from a lot of people, just to sum up, is one of them being trained, and with reluctance on the part of the Army to actually use them in combat situations. And eventually, though, they were utilized. And one dramatic moment was when Eleanor Roosevelt came down and took a flight.
Well, let me tell you a little bit about that. My father, Chauncey Spencer Sr., was there. And what happened is, see, let me give you the connection between Eleanor Roosevelt and Mary Mcleod Bethune. Mary Mcleod Bethune was a very close friend of Eleanor Roosevelt's. And that's how Eleanor Roosevelt learned about what was going on in the black community. And that's how Franklin Roosevelt learned about the needs and the wants that the black community had, that Eleanor Roosevelt had firsthand of. But there was a polio experiment going on in Tuskegee. Meanwhile, Franklin Roosevelt was down in Colorado in the hot springs taking his hot baths for his therapy. And there was some progress with polio. So Eleanor Roosevelt went down there to see about that. Meanwhile, Mary Mcleod Bethune said, while you're down there, Eleanor, take a look at those colored flyers down there. And so she did, and they were flying around. And so while she was there, she decided she wanted to take a flight. It was totally unplanned. And so the Secret Service about had a fit. My father said they were about ready to wet on themselves. And so they made arrangements. Dr. Lewis Jackson, who was the director of Tuskegee training, and Charles Anderson, known as Chief Anderson, was the chief instructor. He was asked to take Eleanor Roosevelt up in the airplane. And I have pictures where Dr. Lewis Jackson helps Eleanor Roosevelt into a Piper Cub, and Chief Anderson takes her up for a flight. And they flew around for about a half an hour. Now, I have an interview, and I've been able to meet both Dr. Lewis Jackson, and I've met Chief Anderson, and I've met his son. And during some of the talks that they had, I have an interview that I have copied that shows where Chief Anderson says during the flight that he and Eleanor were flying around, that they had a nice conversation, and Eleanor Roosevelt says, you know, Amelia Earhart is supposed to teach me how to fly because I want to get into aviation. And so he says that Eleanor and them flew around, they landed. Of course, they took the top pilot, the flyer, which makes sense, the instructor. And so she says, you know what? You guys fly pretty good to me. And so Chief Anderson says, well, thank you. And so Chief Anderson says, I think what happened is that Eleanor went home and says, Franklin, you got to do something about them colored boys down in Tuskegee. They just sitting around and they want to get into action. And so that's the beginning of the president using this as a calling card to create the 99 Pursuit Squadron. And he had to, before they did that, they had to go down to Chanute in Illinois, where they trained the armament group. The armament group were trained before they even decided who the pilots were going to be down in Tuskegee. Meanwhile, they hadn't decided finally if it was going to be down in Tuskegee before all that mess that went on. And it wasn't until they attacked Pearl Harbor that they decided they didn't have any more time to wait. And that's when everything got fast forward within all the programs. And they changed the civilian pilot training program to the War Training Service, WTS. Coffey School of Aviation was one of the only non-universities that was training pilots. Out of the 2,000 Tuskegee Airmen, 450 became fighter pilots, and Coffey School of Aviation trained 200 of those pilots. Not losing one man in an accident, nor a plane being damaged beyond repair. And I'm quoting that from a DVD that I watch over and over.
Okay, that's interesting. So Coffey School of Aviation, a black school of aviation, trained.
That's correct.
200.
200 of the 450 fighter pilots, and a total of training 2,000 of them that went to Tuskegee as pilots, mechanics, navigators. And he also trained B.O. Davis Jr. in his advanced training. Coffey School of Aviation trained him in Chicago. Now, let me tell you this about the little connections we're on the Coffey stuff. Noah Parrish, who's a great, great man, and his wife is a great, great woman. Noah Parrish was stationed in I think it's Glenville, or Greenville. I think it's Glenville, Illinois, outside of that area. Well, he would come down to Harlem Field and look in the fence and see these colored flyers flying around. He had no idea later on that he was going to play a key position in the actions down in Tuskegee. Nor did he know the connection between Cornelius Coffey and that. But when they gave them the contract, Noah Parrish made sure that the Coffey School of Aviation got the same quality of airplanes as any of the other schools got. So we had a friend all the time. We had a friend in the White House. We had a friend in the Senate. We had a friend in the military and high rankings. We had friends. That is the only way that this country will allow any other diverse group to successfully survive and strive. We cannot do it by ourselves.
Okay. Now, what did your father do in the balance of his life?
Oh, tons of things. You got a long piece of paper there. He Some of his accomplishments were after he left. Well, after he finished the Tuskegee Army Airfield assignment. He came back and he integrated Patterson Field in all levels. We had African Americans not only were janitors but were directors. He opened the doors for civilians in the Army Air Corps, later the Air Force. And then he's been given awards for Exceptional Civilian Service Award, the highest award that a civilian could receive in the Army Air Corps at the time, which was given to him for integrating Patterson Field. After that, during that time, there were people in Washington, high-ranking people in Washington, that wanted him to drag his feet on integration, and he told them which way to go. And he says go straight south. And so they didn't like that. And so about 3 weeks later, they branded him under the McCarthy era as being a communist.
This is what year is this?
This is 1951, 52, about 52.
Okay. So this is after the war.
This is after the war. By that time, he had reached a position as a GS-13 in the government, which is as high as you can go. The next position point he'd have to be approved by Congress. And that was his next step. Obviously, they didn't give it to him. But he continued on, and he struggled through the charges, and he was exonerated of his charges. And
how long did it take for him to get exonerated?
About a year.
Okay.
A year. And well, you say it's not bad, but when your citizenship is taken from you in this country, you're a nobody. You can't get a job anywhere. First of all, just think about it. Be black and then be branded a communist, and think about how that works in this country. It's tough enough to be black, and then all of a sudden you don't have any rights either. I think it was horrible. And then he had at that time, I was born in 56. He had my oldest brother was born in 1942. My older sister was born in 49. I had another brother that's alive that was born in 53, and then my next sister was born in 54. So he had 4 kids at that time. It was rough. My mother was the only one who was working, and they wouldn't even give my mother a ride to the house because they thought that she was taboo. My oldest brother was being teased in school. Your father likes the Russians. Your father's a communist. Children could be very cruel to each other. So my brother suffered that. And so it was very tough. But my fathers, we're all made of thick skin. We're not lizards, but we're just about as tough as they are. And so that's how we survived. And then after that, you're asking me what he did. He did several things. After that, he left. Then we were supposed to go to Cherbourg, France, and he was going to be in charge of personnel in France. Well, Congress didn't like that, so they decided they were going to blank that one out. So he didn't have a choice. So he took a demotion, and they bumped his pay scale down to a GS-9, and he became public relations at Norton Air Force Base in San Bernardino, California. Meanwhile, he was still fighting the community and trying to fight for equal rights and for us not to separate ourselves from our own society. So he was fighting against the black and white. He thought we should all be one because we are all one. We're all God's children. And so he fought with the NAACP, and he became president of the NAACP in San Bernardino, California, and fought against the other Axis power, which was the John Birches Society. For those who don't know who the John Birches Society are, Ronald Reagan was the head of the John Birches Society, and it's the West Coast Ku Klux Klan. It's just a very wealthy one.
It's a very right-wing organization.
Yeah. Very similar.
Yeah.
Very, very similar
Sure,
in their meanings.
to be
Yeah.
spoken about in the same
It is.
senses with the
This
Klan and
Tea
American
Party
Nazi.
scares me a little bit too.
This is San Bernardino.
Okay, San Bernardino, California.
San Bernardino. Now during this time, is the association still is it still active? Is the association still active?
What association, sir?
The national.
The NAACP?
No. The
National Airmen Association of
Yeah,
America?
yeah.
No. It left.
When did it go out of
It
existence?
probably. It was only just to get them where they got. So I would have to say, and I'm guessing, but I'm close to right. It probably went on from 1936 up until 1940.
Okay, so after they made their point, they kind of.
Then they turned it into the Coffey School of Aviation.
Okay.
So it spun off from an organization to open the doors for training of minorities into aviation, to an actual school of aviation for anybody. For anybody.
Okay, so in your father in San Bernardino.
My father's in San Bernardino. He was the
NAACP.
president of NAACP, and later on he became the first chairman of the police commission. He was the first African American police commissioner in San Bernardino, the city of San Bernardino. He also was a truant officer for the city of San Bernardino schools. He was a truant officer at San Bernardino High School. And what's the guy's name that plays in Miami Vice? Michael, what is his last name? Do you know what I'm talking about? Well, he played the black guy that played in Miami Vice. Michael, I can't think of his last name. But anyway,
I know what you're talking about.
Okay, well, he graduated from San Bernardino High School in class of 67 along with my older sister. And he came back and told my father that if it wasn't for his toughness, he may not have been a success. He may have been in jail. So I like to hear stories of my mother giving people their first chance for their first job, and now they're successful and have a family to raise, and individuals that became great Hollywood stars and represent the positive part of our society.
Okay. Now, where were you raised, basically?
I was raised in San Bernardino. I was born in Dayton, Ohio, at Miami Valley Hospital, March the 14th, 1956. And then we left and we went to San Bernardino, California in June of 1956. We lived in San Bernardino, California. I went to elementary school and junior high school there. And then when I became in the 9th grade, my father took a job as the deputy administrator for the city of Highland Park, Michigan. And in 1970, we moved to Highland Park, Michigan, where I graduated from Highland Park High School in 1974. Meanwhile, in 1973, I received a scholarship to go to General Motors Institute of Technology, GMI. And I started my engineering training while I was in the 11th grade in high school. And I completed that in 1975. And since then, I've been an entrepreneur. I own Spencer Automotive. I build race cars and race motorcycles, drag race. I act as a consultant, as a troubleshooter with vehicles that are continuously under the limit law or can't be repaired. I do that. I also have started a mentoring program to teach young people to inspire themselves by going back and learning the history of their families, who they should be the most proud of. And I did a program. We received a part of a $50,000 grant from the Kellogg Foundation, and I worked with a school, El Shabazz in Lansing. We worked with from the 3rd graders to the 6th graders. Most of the youth had attention deficit, unstable homes where their parents were drug addicts or prisoners or so on and so forth. And some of their great-grandmothers and grandmothers were raising these children. And so it was an enjoyment to work with them. I'm sorry I couldn't continue to do so. And since then, I've been trying to work and see if I can get some after-school programs going on. I presently hold a position as the president of the Tuskegee Airmen for the Central Region, over 21 chapters that I oversee. I continued the legacy of my father with the Tuskegee Airmen. My father was one of the founding members of the Tuskegee Airmen organization here in Detroit in 1972. His flight suit has been moved from the museum here in Detroit and is now going to be in a permanent exhibit there at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. It's going to be called the Barons of Aviation, and it's no longer going to be called the Black Wings. And that's going to be opening up in November of 2010. And we're going to keep the suit there. I do have it at a 5-year change if I want to move it, but I would not want to move it from the Smithsonian because I know that's one museum. I can be dead for 100 years, and I know that museum will still take good care of my father's things.
Okay. Now, your father passed away in what year? My
father passed away August the 21st of 2002, and I got married to my second wife August 24th. He was going to be my best man, August the 24th of 2002, and my wife died in August 17th of 2008 of cancer.
Okay. Yeah. I know your father was quite a bit older than you, but
yes.
You seem to really enjoy a close relationship in terms of being able to tell the stories and relate to.
I did. He wasn't an old man. My father was a 50-year-old, 30-year-old. My father could still chase me and beat me down when he was 70 years old, and probably a whole lot of other people. Like I said, he was a sheriff. He was a deputy sheriff. He was a police officer. He was a special police officer. He was a truant officer, and he was in good shape. He was 50 years older than I was. I was born in 56. He was born in 06. My mother was born in 22. He said, what you have to do, Pop, as he calls me Pop, because he said I look like his father, Pop. He said, Pop, he said, the reason I stay so young is I pimped for 60 years and I bathed in oil of Olay. So that might be a secret.
Okay. Now, when you look back at the history of the organization and the activities of your father and the other black pilots in those days, what would you consider today to be their legacy?
Give that question to me one more time, if you will.
What would be the legacy of the National
Airmen Association?
Airmen's Association of America?
Okay, thank you. The legacy is that they were a very selfless organization, never looking for recognition, never thought they were doing anything special. They were the individuals that give you the soles on your shoes. And that's what I think that they would want to be considered. They made a pledge that there would be no I in this organization. It was all done under we. It was all done under the National Airmen's Association of America. And that pledge all those members took. And I continue to keep that pledge alive by not saying only Chauncey Spencer, not only Dale White, not only Cornelius Coffey, not only Willa Brown, but they as an organization, as one, as we. And that's what they want to, that's what they would want to be considered, because when you take that and make it personal, then it's no longer powerful.
Okay. Now, did your father ever have any regrets about anything that happened in those days, or things he would do differently that
They've
he
asked him
shared
that
with you?
Yeah, they've asked him that question, and he said he would not go back and do anything any different than he did the first time. He said the life that he lived was a choice life, and he made his own choices, and he lived his own life.
Okay. Well, I'll ask you two questions. Well, first of all, what would you think your father's hopes and concerns would be for the African American community today, and then what would be yours?
I think his concerns will be to don't let nobody pee in your face and tell you it's raining. Don't be fooled by the shiny glass. Paul Robeson's poem, Little Gal, don't let his clothes fool you, because the clothes he wears are fine. There's a humble heart appealing beneath these humble rags of mine, little gal. You never judge a book by its cover.
It's Dunbar, right? Dunbar.
No, that's actually was done by Paul Robeson.
Really? Oh, okay.
Actually, Paul Robeson.
All right, okay.
Actually, Paul Robeson did that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Now, it could have been his poem, but it was recited in the Ann Spencer house by Paul Robeson,
okay,
with his deep baritone voice. And my father's telling the story about he and his two sisters sitting up on the top of the stairs, listening to them recite while Mary Anderson recites hers and Paul Robeson does his poetry. Langston Hughes, where he says, Ann Spencer has an unsharpened pencil. And he just creates a poem out of that.
Yeah, I think that what you're saying is true. It's probably the Dunbar poem recited by Paul Robeson.
Okay.
Yeah, because there's a poem called Little Gal by Dunbar.
Okay, and that's and I
know,
stand
they
corrected.
drill this in our head.
You know, thank you. We learn from each other.
Yes.
So I thank you for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And for yourself, what are some of your hopes and concerns for the African American community today?
Wow. My hopes are, I would hope that I could get our young African American men. See, I don't know if they realize this or not, but I mean, we're becoming third removed. I mean, the system in jobs and in opportunities, they're concentrating now on the African American women. They're not concentrating on us. There are more African American women that are being continuing their education beyond high school. There's more African American women working in jobs that are stable than there are African American men. We are being left behind. The drug trade has become a trade. It's unreal. Destruction within our own communities. We go back to Detroit. You happen to be in an area where the riots jumped off in Detroit, right here. Right there, Rosa Parks, right down the street here, right from where I'm at. The Black Panthers had the church over here where they had their headquarters. Now, if you go back to that time, and you're asking me a question, I'm going to be pretty deep on my answer, is that we have to realize that we are our best friend and our worst enemy. And I hope that my group of people will realize that, you know, it's not how you look on the outside, but it's how you rub people on the inside. So we need to learn that, you know what, you don't have to be an intellectual to be smart. You have to be smart to be an intellectual. And I want them to understand when I tell them they can divide a kilo from an ounce, but I put a math book in front of them and they're not interested. They're doing math all the time. When they can say that the guy out there on the street is not bringing their money back because they know how much money they're supposed to have, they could run a business. They could be CPAs. They need to take all the negatives that they have, my brothers and sisters, take all the negatives you have and make positives out of it. Take that positive. We have all struggled. We have all gone down the wrong roads in our life if we've lived long enough. So none of us are perfect, but we don't have to continue to be imperfect. And that would be my message to my people, that we need to work together and we need to stop hating on each other and we need to help each other and stop acting like crabs in a can when one gets to the top and 17 lock together to pull that one down instead of 17 getting together to leave that one in.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about your family today and what it's involved in. You said something about yourself, but what about your brothers and sisters, your own children?
Yeah, my daughter, well, I'll go with my brothers and sisters first, if you will. I lost, half of my family has died of cancer. So my oldest brother, Edward Spencer, he was named after my grandfather, Edward Spencer. He was considered a genius. In his background, he spent most of his life in prison. And it might have had a lot to do with the way my father was being treated in the family back in the 1940s when he was considered a communist, and people you don't know psychologically what happened. And my brother and myself's ages are so far apart from each other, but I can only just be compassionate and use common sense, that if you live within a war zone, then you probably were affected somewhere. So that would be my brother's spin on that. And I give an excuse for why he spent his time there, because my father was in law enforcement all his life, so they were the opposites of that. The next person would be in my family would be my older sister, and she died of lung cancer. And she was the voters register in Lynchburg. She's very successful. She worked for the governor in Ohio, Governor Celeste. She worked for Governor Celeste at the time, and very well connected, was part of the NAACP. And she married Eddie Reed, who's doing a great job in Chicago, who you happen to know.
He's an organizer of black contractors.
Okay.
Right.
And they have one daughter of the Spencers, and that's Melissa. And she has 2 sons, Ian and Devin. And then we go from there, we go to the next brother, Michael. Michael was a narcotics officer here in Detroit. He's now a building contractor, and he's there taking care of my mother there in Lynchburg, Virginia. And he's older than I. And then we have my sister Luan. My sister Luan has a degree in journalism, and she's going back to school now. I think she's working on her master's. And she has a young family, and her son just graduated from George Mason, and the other 2 girls are on their way to college. And her husband is doing well, and he's in finance. And then we have yours truly, and you know about me. And then we have my brother younger than me, who was born March 14th, 1958, 2 years apart from me. And he was in the Marines, and he died a tragic death. He committed suicide. And then I have my sister Shawn, who's doing well. She's been married, and she's a widow. Her husband was the first black African-American vice president of Fidelity Bank. And she's keeping the Ann Spencer Foundation alive, and the legacy of the Ann Spencer Foundation, working with young people in the schools, and is now a playwright, has written her first play called Annie's Pencil, which was a great hit. And then after that, we have my baby sister, Kyle, and Kyle died of MS when she was 43 years old. And that's my whole family, my brothers and sisters. And then we have my daughter, Jenny Spencer, and she's graduated from college, and she was on the Today Show today, as a matter of fact. And she is working in the theater and arts, and she's also one of the pictures that they've bought from her that Nike will be using. Nike's bought her image to use in the Christmas advertisements. So she'll be in the Nike advertisements for their product this year.
Now, what was she on Today Show for?
I'm not sure what she was on. Something to do with modeling.
Okay.
And the reason I have to tell you I'm not sure is because she does so many things, so I don't want to make a mistake and tell you the wrong thing. But she was on the Today Show, and she and a friend of hers are now traveling cross country. He's moving back to Las Vegas, and getting this furniture together, and so she's taking a cross-country trip, so she'll be driving from Massachusetts to Las Vegas. And so she's en route now, and she'll be here to see me on Friday probably.
Okay.
Yeah, but Jenny Spencer, she's done very well in her schools. And then I have other nephews. My oldest nephew, Edward's son, he works for Michael's Arts in Seattle, Washington. And then Melissa's next, and she lives in Lynchburg, Virginia, raising her family, Eddie Reed's daughter. And then I have my brother, he has 2 sons. They live here in Detroit, Michael. And then Luan, she has 2 daughters and 1 son. And then who do I have missing? And I believe, and Sean, my sister Sean, she has a son that's still attending college named Jordan. And that's basically my family, and I hope I didn't forget anybody. Please forgive me if I did. And when you have a big family, you can forget some of them because there's somebody that takes place. No, I'm just playing. But anyway, there's a lot of them.
Now, do you have any plans to write, or have you? What have you written about this already, or
Nothing.
produced in terms of video or any other media?
I have video. I've done videos. There's videos on me, several videos on me. And if you have time, I will show you a quick one, about 20 minutes, if I can get you time for that. But I'm involved.
Just give us the name of it for the sake of this tape that people will see.
It's part of somebody else's. I'm just on it. Okay. It's not specifically on me. So no, to answer your question, there hasn't been one put on me. This is the first one.
I wouldn't just say but about the National
Airmen Association.
Airmen Association.
Yeah, the function Milwaukee School of Aviation was sponsored by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Dr. Hale was the principal of it, and he invited me down as a guest speaker. So I have that DVD that was done by a professional group that put that together. And then there's another one that was done where I accompanied, oh my goodness, Mae Jamerson, first African-American female astronaut in Los Angeles. This part of the program where I showed you the young girl Kimberly and their flight from Los Angeles, or actually from Compton to Newport News, and back. And that's Kim and Kelly, and I have to say both their names so their sisters don't get mad at me. So Kim and Kelly are the 2 individuals that did that. So I'm involved in that program. As far as writing, I've been told and been asked and been said, when are you going to do it? Since 2005 that I'm working on this book, but I am working on the book. I'll show you my closet, and I have a fire hazard in the closet because I got tons and tons of paper. And some of it are going to be actual papers. Now, my father wrote a book that's not been published yet, and I have it. And I don't know who I'm going to give it to and what I'm going to do with it, but I have the book. And it goes all the way back to the fights all the way from the Seminole tribes, and it talks about the Seminole Indians when during slavery, when the Spaniards and the British were fighting over places like Florida. And it shows where the other Indian tribes, they accepted slaves for payment, and they used them as slaves, but the Seminoles never used a slave as a slave. They gave them their own piece of land, and the slaves would create crops of corn or whatever, and they'd give them a percentage of the corn. But the Seminoles never ever had slaves. And I'm proud to say that I'm a Seminole.
Okay. Now, is there anything I have not discussed that we need to talk about before I ask my last question?
Wow, I would like to say that there's probably always something that we haven't asked, but I would like to thank you on this, if I can right now, not to end it, but just to thank Julia Richardson and the time that it takes and the cost that it has taken you to come here, and for me to be honored, as she explained to me, that they were not in the process of interviewing second generations of this history, but because I was so determined to be so, I think it's God's sendings, because the first time I was going to be interviewed, it was canceled, and the second time, I was gritting my teeth that could happen, and I just want to thank everybody that made it possible, because now it gives a new spin and a new chapter in how African Americans got involved in aviation, and it gives all these individuals a voice. It gives Eugene Bullard a voice now. It gives Bessie Coleman a voice now. It gives William Powell a voice now. It gives James Bannion a voice now. It gives Cornelius Coffey a voice now. Willa Brown, Grover Nash, Chauncey Spencer, Dale White, and many others that I have not named, and I will continue to do the same thing that I'm doing, and I will be their voice. And we, as young people that live longer than the others, we have to go back and be the voice. We can be the voice for these people. And that's what we have to do. And that's how we keep our young people educated and they know more about civil rights than Martin Luther King, who was a great person. But in order to know about Martin Luther King, don't you think you should know about Vernon Johns? Don't you think you should know about A. Philip Randolph? Don't you think you should know about Ralph Abernathy? Don't you think you should know about these individuals that I can just pop out of my head? That when I was younger, they didn't shake me around. I wasn't that interested in it. I was more interested in doing the skate and hanging out in the 1970s. But I have matured to the point where all the stuff that I was learning, I had no idea. I was in the area and was learning all the time. Because your brain is like a sponge. And you don't know what you absorb until later on you see it and then you use it and you say, wow, I didn't know I knew that. And that's how I know what I know.
Okay. Well, thank you. And the last question is similar to legacy, but a little different. Sir, how do you think that these black aviators we've been discussing would or how do you think they ought to be remembered?
I think they ought to be remembered as their selfless, giving ways that they intended to be. They were not trying to do anything great. They were just trying to do what their dreams told them to do. And I think that if we remember them as that, not as that they were the first or they're the most important, but people have stories and every story is important. And I think their story is received as being important. And I would remember them as a lesson of what can be done and what has been done. That's where I would take it.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So we're done with this part, and we just
Okay.
have to go to the photos.